But first, the implications of the decisions that the ANC has to make in terms of which political party it will eventually decide to work with, either in a formal coalition or in some other kind of agreement. One of the big trends of the last few years has been a growing role for the private sector. Look at what the private sector is doing in generating electricity, in transport, in providing security. Professor Lawrence Hamilton's a professor in political theory at Wits University. Professor, good afternoon to you. We've seen a real change. No one mentions the privatization, the P word. But since the pandemic, we've seen the government sector shrinking and the private sector growing. Do you think that at these coalition discussions, the decision that the ANC makes could change that?
Yes, very much so. I think that whether it goes hand in hand with the DA or whether it goes hand in hand with the EFF plus a few other smaller parties, or whether it goes towards a minority government or a government of national unity of some form or other, will make a lot of difference. Because, of course, the EFF and others that think of themselves as left-leaning parties will be strongly opposed to further influence of the private sector. That's going to have really serious consequences for where we've got ourselves and where the ANC has got us into, unfortunately, which is a kind of forced privatization, which doesn't necessarily lend itself to good development decisions. But I'm sure you'll unpack that.
You say that it's a sort of forced privatisation, and I presume you're referring to what in some cases is an almost collapse in government services. Look at the problems with Transnet and our railways, for example. So if it's a forced privatisation, can it really be reversed? I mean, can it really be unpicked?
Well, I mean, most definitely it can be unpicked. The question is whether you've got the political will and the political capacity and the state capacity to bring that process around and to, respond to these public interests that questions of security, the questions of transport, the questions of energy provision are responding to and providing for, to a position in which the public sector, the state, is in a position to make decisions in line with the public's interest, both nationally and globally in some sense, because this is also a matter for considerations around climate change and those sorts of things. So it's a rather strange situation that we've got into in South Africa. Both other comparatively developing countries, but also developed countries, they make their decisions often not in the way that we've had to make decisions as a consequence of the collapse and failure of our infrastructure or of our various public infrastructure, but they make decisions mostly if they're effective governments in terms of what sorts of directions they want to take their countries in terms of development and growth. And South Africa has not been growing, and it hasn't been developing. It hasn't been making infrastructure decisions based upon choice, but based upon necessity, because of the very serious failures that a lot of people will know very clearly, and they feel and they have felt for many years every day with load shedding, etc.
So, I mean, if there was a sort of reversal of this policy, I mean, and let me just go back a bit, there are voices in our society and the sort of business sector who really are cheerleaders for this process of privatization that nobody wants to talk about, or nobody wants to use that word. And they obviously have interests in that. It may be good for them. It's good for the mines to be able to, and it should be good for everybody, but it's not actually that great in many ways. I mean, many people suddenly don't receive services that they used to get from the government, and these services are then have a profit motive to them as well.
Exactly. There are certain kinds of areas of the economy where direct market competition works really efficiently. There are other areas of the economy where it fails and fails repeatedly. And those are areas where competition is very difficult to generate. For example, in rail services in the UK, we see the effects. We've seen the effects of that for many years. In the privatization of water since 1989 in the UK, you now see the effects where private companies have been dumping huge amounts of sewage into rivers, mainly because they're not competing with others in the provision of the same good. They may be competing across the country, but they can't compete in the provision of water because there is only one single pipeline that comes to any particular city. And so the idea of effective competition there is nonsensical. So effectively what happens is that the interests of the shareholders, as a consequence of the privatization of that company, ends up trumping the interests of the consumer, which is the everyday, consumer of water. And that's been a really serious problem, even in a highly developed country like the UK. And we've seen that in South Africa, what's happened is that these things like security, which is something that a state must provide if it's going to be an effective state, things like energy and things like transport and freight, etc., are all matters where competition is really difficult to create where the profit motive has the incentive to generate more efficient and better provision of that good. In those instances, the state, generally speaking, when it's an efficiently run and administered state, tends to provide the best mechanism to satisfy those goods or those needs. And the reason, but that's only possible, of course, when the state has the capacity and the political will to do that.
There's another point that I think I do need to ask. I'm asking everyone, Professor Hamilton. Do you think, with all of the discussions around coalitions, that in fact we will have some kind of coalition government by the deadline, which really is legally, I suppose, next Sunday, maybe technically in a way by next Friday? Do you think that actually we might find that we're in for a situation where things are quite uncertain for quite a long time? And the reason this is important in the context of this conversation is that until there is certainty, this process of privatization will probably continue.
Yes, I mean, I think there probably will be a way forward. I don't think the various actors have that much of an option. Of course, we can muddle through and find other options where there isn't compromise, where there isn't sufficient compromise, and where there isn't coalition. But I suspect that there will be a coalition of some form or other, or a minority government. But frankly, I don't really think that's going to change our development trajectory in the short to medium term. So I think that what we're living in South Africa is a medium-term unbundling of the state's capacity since, frankly, 2009, 10, 11, where the state gets, high levels of corruption, mismanagement, and various other things, disables the capacity of the state to carry out many of these functions. To return the state to a capable state is not a short-term project. It's a medium to long-term project. So in some sense, whatever coalition is formed, it's not going to be something that changes much of what I was talking about in the article you're making reference to. And that is that because we're in a sense that to use economist language, there's been a path dependency that's been created by these various failures. And to get out of that path dependency, you've got to have a really organized, determined decision-making state and government. And for that, of course, you need a government that can direct this. Now, if you have so in one sense, it doesn't really matter that much, but in another sense, it really, really does. And that is, from my perspective, if, for example, Cyril Ramaphosa continues along his very firm consensus line, we may end up with a government of national unity. And in that instance, I think we might be in the worst of all worlds, unless, of course, we're thinking of some kind of strange MK coalition, which is not likely anyway. But in that kind of government of national unity, you may end up in a situation in which it becomes extremely difficult for decisions to be made by government because there's so many different ideological and other sorts of positions that make up the government. And in that case, yeah, we're not going to have good, strong, firm leadership.